Hi, Seamus.
Hello, Mr. Zombie Hunter. It's good to be with you this morning.
Thank you. Yeah, so I asked you to come on because uh, you are a sort of rising star in the objectivist architect space and the Minecraft space, I would add probably. And in Ayn Rand's works, there's a lot of discussions about architecture, but perhaps people may don't know how to fully appreciate it or don't know what exactly to look for, even though deep inside they know something is wrong or something is right. And I will stop talking now and I will let you explain to us how to appreciate good architecture.
Okay. So thank you for that introduction. I'll add a few things. I have been doing architecture now for 9 years. Um, it has been an obsession of mine that I eventually discovered because there were so many things I wanted to do, so many creative pursuits I considered that I couldn't pick between them. And I chose to go into architecture because an architect is someone who ties all of those things together into one. And you have, in a sense, as an architect, you're a jack of all trades. And your goal is to understand a lot of very broad principles about something. You have to understand what is a brick and what is a beam. Not as well as the stonemason, and you don't have to understand the beam as well as the structural engineer, but you need to understand them both well enough on a basic level to bring together an integrated whole. And to do that artistically is something that takes a lot of design. And the beautiful thing about architectural art is that everyone has lived in a house. Whereas if you compare it to um, people who are doing 3D renderings or people who are doing paintings, you might see the Jackson Pollock painting on the wall with all of the paint splashes, and you say to yourself, "Oh, it adds color to the room." I'm not a painter. I don't really need to worry about that. But everyone has lived in a house, um, so it's a no BS form of way to do art, and it's the art of creating a tool for living on Earth. The tool that is the shelter, and the entire way that you enhance a space, both spiritually and physically.
I do like the no BS approach to things. I tend to find that it's helpful to pin something to reality at some point.
Yeah. And we'll, as we go into this conversation, and I start my screen share, we'll look at some examples of BS in architecture, and we might even talk about why it's like that. So I'll start my screen share and give kind of my general thesis that is going to be kind of the heart of what I'm talking about today. So let me just get this going. You can verify. You can see that just fine. Um, so when we look at buildings and when we look at architecture, what is always said is that form follows function. We understand that in the same way that a butterfly's wings must be the same size so that it can fly straight, um, that so it works well, so it looks good. Um, what we don't always think about, what we rarely think about, and what we take for granted in architecture, is that the function of a building, while it's true that the form of a building follows its function, you expect a different home and a different building for one purpose than you do for another. What people don't think about is the fact that while form follows function, function follows values. So when you're making a building, it's impossible not to entrench in that building all of the little value assessments that you're making in the process. And that's why when you're working with an architect, you need to find someone who thinks clearly and who you share values with. Because if you share values, he is going to value what you value, or at
That,
least know how to value what you value.
that's interesting. I mean, maybe I can ask for like a quick opinion on how to choose the right architect for you, or is that a complicated question?
Uh, well, so first, what you should do when you're looking for an architect, and this is kind of a side tangent, um, but I'll say on that, when you choose an architect, the most important thing is for you to see what type of work they've done. And if it's a new architect, that it doesn't need to be a barrier for entry, but you need to be able to look at least at their sketches or what sort of design they do, and you need to make sure that you like it and that it looks good. So that's the first thing I'd say is the portfolio. The second thing that I would make sure I look at is the character of the person. Anyone who, even if they have good-looking buildings, if the way that they're communicating with you if they don't seem like a straight shooter, then it's going to be a very painful process for you to get the end product that you want. You want an architect who's an extremely, to use the term I used before, no BS kind of person, because a lot of times an architect is someone who you go to and you say, this is my dream home, I want this, I want to build this, and you need to trust him to sometimes say, no, you don't have the kind of money for that sort of house. And so if you want to achieve something like that, we need to either bring down the program to something more buildable, or we need to reevaluate our approach. So I would say honesty, in a single word, is the second thing. First you need experience, and then you need honesty. And then beyond that, you just need someone who has like the energy and the time to devote to the project, because it's a very long, challenging process when you're going into actually working with an architect. So I think if you have someone who's honest and has a good goal in mind, good value assessments, and has the time and energy to put towards the project, I think you're going to have a pretty good end product going forward.
Interesting.
But to get back on my sort of agenda here about value, it's there was something Ayn Rand said which was that if you show me the woman that a man is attracted to, and I'll tell you everything he values about life, because she recognized that it works both ways. That when you appreciate something, it implies a certain thing that's worth appreciating, and that says a lot about you. Well, the same I think can be said of buildings, because when you say form follows function and different people come up with different answers, what that's revealing about them is that they have fundamentally different value premises. So a person who has a mindset of control and who wants the world to be strong and secure and uncompromising, but also is very materialist. They think of a building and they think, well, a building just needs to provide you shelter. When a person like that thinks of what the function of a building is, they're probably going to come away with something close to brutalism. Brutalism is the architecture of rigid, harsh forms. So if I take this image here, this is the architecture of dictatorship, essentially.
Can I just say that looked a little
Yeah.
bit like a prison, even though I realize it can't possibly be a prison. It seems like a dystopian future kind of prison.
Yeah. And there are people who are fans of brutalism, and I give them the benefit of the doubt that the things they like about it are the things about it that aren't evil. But there are fundamental problems with it as a style that we'll go into. Now, the other thing you might see when someone builds what they consider a functional building is you might see something like the work of Mies van der Rohe, he was one of the pioneers of minimalism. And so he would make a building like this one here. This is the Farnsworth house. And it's all completely open. He's tried to pare down the structure to as little as possible. And there is a beauty to doing that. But you see a building like this, you see especially the extremes of minimalism. This is a pretty beautiful house to live in. But minimalism taken to its extreme, that's the functional manifestation of nihilism. If you don't have anything that you value, if you don't have anything that you need out of your building, you're going to approach something that looks like basically a roof to keep off the water and not much else. So you go from something that's authoritarian,
Mm-hmm.
and you get brutalism. And if you come from something that's more nihilistic, then you're probably going to go somewhere closer to minimalism.
Can I
Or,
can I ask a small
yeah,
quick question about minimalism?
yes.
So I'm familiar with the movement of minimalism, and it's the idea is that you have a lot of headspace and the room is very open and you can do stuff. But
Hmm.
I obviously some people take it to a bit of an extreme in terms of like let's say the furniture that they want. Like they won't pick a couch; they'll just pick a bunch of pillows and they can put them away. And you'll have very few personal
Hmm.
items on display. And it seems to me that coming from a person that has children and like everything's toys in the living room, that minimalism is very appealing. But at some point, I feel that it loses its personality and it's very cold after a certain point.
Yeah. So minimalism is appealing to people who, like you said, want a lot of headspace and they want things clean and they need to think about things. And minimalism, I don't consider to be a failed style in the way that brutalism is, because there is definitely merit in paring down the parts of the building that that you need to build and just focusing on the views. And to the extent that that's what we're talking about, I like to use the term maximalism. I want to maximize everything that I want out of the building. Um, but no point along that chain of thought does it become necessary to strip away from a building all of the character. And that's an essential of minimalism that I don't endorse. So, a building like this, I actually like this house. This is a very benevolent example of minimalism. There's others that are that I can maybe think of as we go through here that give a harsher understanding of it. But you're correct. It's a mixed style, and the longer you, I think, the more you're trying to get out of your building, the more you're going to see character and value and interesting features to it seep in. Minimalism is a starting point for people who want no nonsense. If it's an ending point, um, then that's more of a problem because um, it's useful to have walls. So I'll keep returning to this image as my balance. This is my favorite one. And then finally, I wanted to say that if someone values tradition, um, then the buildings you're going to see come from them are going to be very classical buildings, and it's going to be imitations of classical buildings to boot, um, because these are people who are trying to enshrine tradition. And there's
And
a lot of ways to do this, depending on what area you're from.
you know, it's interesting. It's to some degree, I can kind of appreciate what you're saying, like just by looking at the picture, and it seems like you're adding a lot of layers to it that I may not have necessarily been obvious to me. I would add that in the UK in particular, you don't really have a choice in the house that you make. In fact, it's kind of discouraged. Like people like it that there's like a row of houses that are built exactly the same, and you just,
Yep.
do something like with the furniture on the inside with a few paintings or something like that. Um, and it's kind of expected that you just be quiet and not complain and just live
Yeah.
that way.
And I wanted to pull up this building as an example of a typical government treasury building as a good example of the traditionalist approach, the
Okay.
classical approach to architecture. There was actually an attempt under the Trump administration to pass an ordinance. I think it was some sort of federal ordinance even that said that all government buildings had to be built in a classical style. Um, this was done by an activist to try and halt the advancement of all of these brutalist styles, which had become admittedly very popular in government buildings in the 1970s.
I
Um,
see. Is it to intimidate
but
people coming into the building to like make them seem smaller?
Yep, and also the people who are in the building.
Okay.
When you're building a brutalist government building, let's see. There's one example that comes to mind. if I can pull
So,
this up
so this
here.
building symbolizes bureaucracy, tradition and bureaucracy. Follow the
This
rules.
this building specifically is traditionalism.
Okay.
If you want a pure bureaucracy, which has no reference for tradition whatsoever, you would look at this building. Let me pull this image here.
I'm afraid now.
Um,
I'm scared for my
yes,
life.
this is a more this is a better example of someone who values only force and only material. There's no nourishment of the spirit to this building. In fact, it's meant to dominate it. Um,
How did
Everything
you how
from
did
the
you get all that?
arrangement.
I don't understand how you got all that. That's like very
Hmm.
insightful, but where?
Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of little things you can notice about the building that when you think about its effect on a person, you can come away with the understanding of its significance. So the first thing that I'll talk about as we dive into brutalism here um, is that when you look at the base of a brutalist building,
Hmm.
there is a complete lack of feature to the lower areas of it. As you walk up to the building, it's as if you're walking up to a sheer cliff. Think of the energy of someone who's standing at the base of a fjord in Norway,
Hmm.
at the foot of a massive sheer piece of rock that goes up.
Okay.
There's an awe to that, but there's also a feeling of helplessness. You can't climb up it. It's this uncompromising massive rock face that towers over you, and you're helpless to climb up this thing unless you have access to advanced tools.
So it's like a
Um,
big white tiny human.
it's like a big what?
It's like be quiet, tiny human while you come into this building.
Yes. So in the same way that a cathedral is a building that takes a similar approach of trying to make the person small. But when you look up at a cathedral, you're seeing this art and all of these human achievements in a sense.
Hmm.
Let me pull up a picture of a cathedral. And the goal of a cathedral in the value sense is to say under the person who walks in it that you are a being under God, right? You look at this building and you feel the glory of all of this tremendous engineering that's going all around you, and all of this beauty and these patterns.
Hmm.
People who were religious at this time had this great appreciation for mathematics and the forms that took on.
Well, that's
You look at
interesting.
this building and it impresses upon you sort of this purpose to it's meant to impress upon you the idea of a broader purpose. Um, there's all of this stuff up there to be achieved. When you look at the other building, um, by contrast, um, it's similar in the sense that it's towering over you, and they have these very high portico entrances as you pull up into it. Um, but instead of holding out to you this artistic pattern work and this rhythm of forms that logically pleases your mind, it's a pattern,
Hmm.
they give you this morass of features. And um, unlike the cathedral, they're not clean. Instead, they're muddy and they're dirty, and they're not beautiful and rounded or circular with their little pattern to them. Instead, it's a harsh, arbitrary, rectangular concrete, whatever worked in the structural form.
Can I ask?
Um,
Can I
and
ask one?
so
Can I ask one thing though? It does appear to have a sort of mathematical pattern to it, at least
at the top, it
at
does.
the top. Yeah.
Um, yeah, and that's for functional purposes. That's important for the building to have. I think, at a certain point, every building runs into budgetary constraints, and they can't afford. If you're a brutalist architect, this front area is the beautiful part of the building to you, and this is just where you needed to get more expansion of the floor plate up above. So it's true that there's a rhythm to it, and that's actually the best part of the building. But another thing to think about is when it comes to rhythm, this is a tangent, but Frank Lloyd Wright, the greatest architect of all time, as far as we know,
Okay.
um, used to describe architecture as frozen music. And what he meant by that was that there's all of the different components to a melody and to a song and to a rhythm in music. They have an analogy in a physical space. And so if you look at this building, especially at the upper portion of it, ask yourself what the song is that's being played along this piano. It's monotonous in that it's ding 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 ding, right? There's only one type of pillar up here.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's no melody to that. And then ask yourself by contrast, what song is being played on the roof of this cathedral.
Probably a choir.
Here,
I would
it's a
assume a
choir,
choir,
right?
yeah.
You have the high notes and the like the bravado of the singer who's carrying the melody, and then you have all of the backup from all of these other singers in perfect harmony that go along with it. So it's true that there's a rhythmic element to the brutalist building, and for structural reasons, if nothing else, and financial reasons, you're always going to have some of that. But just because you have that doesn't mean that you have a song. So when it comes to buildings, we if we want it to look beautiful, we try to take it further than that. And then let's see, where was I? We got into the brutalist tangent pretty early.
And inside, we can imagine there's all these cubicles that are all gray.
Yep.
And
Perhaps, yeah, they probably have interior concrete partitions. And yeah, we were talking about the psychological effects of it. A building like this it demands conformity. You can't hang a picture on the wall when the wall is made of concrete. You tap your hammer and it dings off. This building does not say I want to work with you. It says you need to comply with me. If you go into a concrete jail cell, everything about that space, all of the ways that as humans, we naturally interpret our space in terms of how we interact with it. How does it touch? How does it feel? How does it sound? You go into a concrete cell, and that has a psychological effect on you. You think about how you would feel for an hour trapped inside of a concrete box, and then you think about how you would feel for an hour trapped inside a cathedral or trapped inside of this building. It's night and day, the psychological difference that has on you, and that's because your mind is designed to constantly take in perceptual information, and it constantly gleans information about the world from that. So it's no surprise that an authoritarian government likes a style like brutalism because it normalizes a certain type of compliance and a certain type of hopelessness. A building like this, you're standing in the middle of the room in front of your fireplace, looking out the windows. You see the wooden elements on the ceiling advance out in front of you, and this gives you a feeling of power. It's an extremely empowering space to be in. Any brutalist building, it does the exact opposite. There's so many good examples. If anyone listening searches the term brutalism, you'll see what I mean, and that there's a common thread of almost a hopelessness to it.
so for people who are interested in a house for themselves, I'm getting the feeling that we're looking for something that empowers you, gives you like a clear headspace to think, so
Hmm.
far, from what I understand, and kind of like help you function better in your day-to-day life.
Absolutely. Yeah, you don't want to you don't want your house to be confining. Especially, I think a lot of us can appreciate that after COVID, if we're talking about houses specifically. But I would say it goes even beyond houses. Architecture isn't just the art of houses; it's the art of any space. And there's architecture of a pavilion. There's architecture of a stone monument. The Washington Monument is an example of architecture. It defines the space in a certain way. It's a place that you are. Um, and yeah, absolutely. One thing that is taken for granted, and this is a thread that goes from philosophy to architecture and to all the rest of art, is there's a pervading materialism and an utter neglect for the spiritual wants and needs of man. You look at buildings that exist in Marxist dictatorship, and you kind of see,
Oh, I would like to see an example of that.
yeah, I think I'm Red Palace. No, the Red Palace is different. Let me see. What's a good example? Cuban Parliament.
I want to see like gulag-esque design
Yeah,
with a touch of enforced working.
yeah. Let's see. I'll have to. I might have to think about that one because all that's coming to mind for that is the brutalist buildings that we've looked at already. And I don't want
Okay.
to spend the entire conversation talking about brutalism either, because there's so many different values to achieve. And I think as we get towards the
It's too depressing, you're saying,
and
yes?
it's too depressing. Yes, you can look up brutalism and you can look at examples of these examples of buildings that are extremely domineering and monotonous.
Okay.
But we also want to be celebrating life as we go. So there's three parts that we're going to have to this podcast. The first part's what we're in. We're talking about values in broad terms
Mm-hmm.
and how they manifest in the architectural space. The second part, I made an image ahead of time that I think you'll like. It's an architectural alignment chart, and we're going to go over some contrast there. And then the third part, you wanted some pictures from my Minecraft, from the Minecraft server I'm on, and how things manifest there.
Yes, please.
So can you tell me how we're doing on time,
Yeah, yeah, we're fine.
or what our timestamp is? We
Infinite
have
time,
we're
Seamus,
okay.
as
Okay,
much as you need to empower yourself and able to express your values to the audience.
fantastic. Because you were talking about what sort of house you want, and now I'm going to talk about Usonian architecture,
Okay.
which is my favorite, probably my favorite single style. Um, and it was, of course, led by Frank Lloyd Wright. Um,
Frank again doing
and
good
let me
work.
pull. Yep. And there's a few things that are essential
Ooh.
about the Usonian style, and a few facts about reality and value judgments about reality that conveys when you look at one of these homes. Um, the first thing that's really striking about buildings in this style is that they stretch themselves out horizontally. Unlike the cathedral, where all of the budget was spent on building what's above you,
Mm-hmm.
um, buildings that are done in this style are expansive. It's like the feeling of power you have when your arms are outstretched. When you look at Usonian buildings, there's one that's an even better example of this. It's in California, and they call it it's called the Marin County Civic Center, the only government building that he ever worked on. And there's so many beautiful buildings of this building, beautiful images of this building, and how it stretches itself out across the earth. Um, and the style of it was so ahead of its time that they attempted to block the building. They said it was a communist design, and the conservatives of the time said it was a communist design because they wanted something that looked extremely traditional, like a castle sitting on top of a hill. And Frank Lloyd Wright said, "Well, what are you talking about? You have this beautiful landscape here. I don't want to bulldoze any of it. I want the building to like play with the landscape." And so he came up with this design that was a building with two wings that would stretch itself across the landscape. And
Is this for government offices again?
it's the only public project Frank Lloyd Wright ever did.
Okay.
Um, and yeah,
W-
it's a beautiful set of offices.
with the
And
design
this
of the
is
windows and the circular cap in the middle, I'm getting like a Persian Persian kind of vibe.
Yeah, and I'm not sure what Frank Lloyd Wright's influence was when he created the building. But what's interesting about this building is it was so ahead of its time that they used it. It was influential in the realm of science fiction and science fantasy.
Okay.
Star Wars fans will probably remember the city of Naboo. Um, and sure enough, let me pull up an example here. If you look at the cityscape in the city of Naboo in Star Wars, you essentially have the roof of the Marin County Civic Center over here on the right. Um, and if you, it's even more striking if you look at an image like this one, which comes at it from the side. Um, it's the same basic style, and that's because people saw this building and it was inspiring to them.
It's interesting.
Uh,
What
and
is
there's
so
several examples of that with Frank Lloyd Wright's work.
what is so appealing? What is the um I guess what is appealing about the cap kind of style of buildings? Like the Naboo one had more of them. This one has one in the middle.
Mm.
What is the appeal?
Um, so I think one thing that you can look at right away is the fact that it's a shallow pitch roof.
Hmm.
So if you build a cathedral, all of your roof slopes are very vertical. And there's kind of a dual reason for that. I think in the Fountainhead, it was probably overplayed the extent to which that was a philosophical decision, because the reality is that when you're building with cheap building materials, or when you don't have access to synthetic polymers like we do now, you can't build a flat roof. You can't build a flat roof out of brick pavers. You have to stack them very vertically and get something that's very high. And I think designers at the time they took that fact and they combined it with their ideas about man, and so they made these buildings that were towering and very pointy. The Civic Center, though, is a complete opposite idea. Instead of trying to like tower over you with these big pointy forms, this is as you walk up into the building, you can see it's right down low on the level of man. And the other thing that I think he was doing aesthetically with this building that was based on his understanding of the function, he was thinking of this as a government building. And the idea of a government building is that every individual citizen goes to there and has access to what that government is meant to provide. You know, we're all equal under the law, as they say. And I think you can see that in the design choices here, where he has this rhythmic element here that goes along, and you can kind of just imagine every single individual citizen making up this building. And I think that's why it got called communist, was because they thought, oh, that's very proletarian of him. But for a building in this sense, it makes sense. And to get back on my general read on Usonian architecture, it takes that philosophy, a lot of the same philosophies, the outstretched arms and the rhythmic element. And one other thing which is essential to it, want to find a new picture of a Usonian house here as I scroll through my Google. I like this one a lot. Let's go over here. Yeah. Another thing that's really important about this style is that it has a reverence for the earth itself. If you look at modernist buildings, there is they love the monochrome.
Mm.
They love when a building is black and white. And that's because they've realized that the existence of these rich colors that we're surrounded by is a manifestation of something that they don't necessarily want to endorse. They want to strip all of the features out of a building, and so they strip out the color as well. So that's an example of color itself as a value adjustment, right? If you don't value the world around you, you you throw away all the colors. You know, the blue of the sky, the green of the grass, the yellow of the rock. All of that is out, and instead you default to mathematical extremes. What is the least light we can reflect and the most light we can reflect? And that's your color palette. Instead, when you look at a Usonian house, there's this great appreciation for the earth tones and what it means to live on Earth. And when you look at the interior spaces, I want to pull up the ballroom at Taliesin, which is a building I was fortunate enough to grow up near. Yes, this building here. If I drag this tab over, this is another great example of a Usonian approach to aesthetic, where we can see the colors. We can see the colors of life in spring green Wisconsin. You know, the sandstone is represented in the finishes, and that's literally Frank would take the stone that was under the building and he would use it for the floor and the fireplace, and he would take the sand and he would use it in his plaster, and he would take the trees that grew around and he would cut them down and then oil the wood. And whenever possible, he would take that approach because he wanted the palette of the building to celebrate everything that was around you. And that was an essential component of Usonian, an essential part of what he called organic architecture was his term for it. But the point was making a building that loves where it lives, versus a building that is kind of like a landed spaceship. It came down from out of nowhere and it has no connection to anything. Which was something that was more in Mies van der Rohe's court, and he was the pioneer of minimalism. He was the one who said, you've probably heard the saying, "Less is more."
Mm-hmm.
That's a Mies van der Rohe quote, and
It's actually
this is
in my occupation that is a very common saying. It's to do with reducing complexity, though.
mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's where you kind of have to parse, because there's definitely times in life when more is more and less is less.
Mm-hmm.
So the benevolent view of minimalism is that you're removing the arbitrary. The actual view of minimalism, which I hold, is that you're removing everything.
Where
And you
does
don't want to take it to that extreme.
so with regards to the Usonian, so there's like an element
Mm.
of being part of a natural kind of natural environment, or that the building is natural to its environment, and then you're complementing
Mm-hmm.
it's not just your house, it's the city where you're in, it's the countryside where you're in. It's a bit more of a broad term, I suppose, or the effect is. But on a different
Mm-hmm.
matter, with regards to the less is more, where does simplicity and the reduction of complexity enter architecture?
Right.
I don't want to go back to
Fun
minimalism.
fact.
I just mean just simplicity, as in not complex.
Yeah, it's a great question. And fun fact, there's been very few, there were very few architects that Frank Lloyd Wright respected in his day, very few thinkers that he respected. Um, and so among people who stayed at Taliesin, which is the building that we're looking at right now, Ayn Rand came and stayed there when she wrote The Fountainhead.
Okay.
And also, Mies van der Rohe came and visited, and he was the architect of this building. So what does that say? Well, what it says is that there was a respect that Frank Lloyd Wright had for what Mies van der Rohe was achieving in all that he was able to remove from the building. And there's a lot he did that Mies van der Rohe did that was worth removing. And also, if you think of it in the way Frank Lloyd Wright thinks of it in terms of vernacular architecture, it's true that when you're living in Spring Green, Wisconsin, out in the countryside, you want a building like this. But it's also true that when you're in a giant city of steel, the vernacular is somewhat different. It's not going to matter to anyone that you used the stone that was native to the site if the stone is all buried under concrete in a parking garage and underground parking. So another building that Mies van der Rohe became famous for was the Seagram building. and I'm pulling up a picture of that building right now. Ooh, I need a bigger one. Hold up. This one here. Yeah, this is a little better. So this was Mies van der Rohe's possibly one of his greatest work. Was he invented this concept of a skyscraper that was completely pared down to the steel and the glass. And what you find when you look at the aesthetic principles of the building, you find that it's contextual, the design language that you have, because if you're like we discussed before, you're out in the woods, this is your vernacular outside. You chose to live out in the country for a reason, and so you're going to have a building that's of the country. On the other hand, if you chose to live in the city, you're going to have a building that's of the city. And that you're going to appreciate either of those options much more than if they were plopped in the middle of the other. You wouldn't want to see this building necessarily rising out of a hill in the middle of nowhere, and you wouldn't want to see the reverse. Now, to answer your original question, which is how do we decide when to stop removing? How do we achieve the merits of minimalism without removing our value judgments from the building? The answer I have to that is related to structural considerations. And this is a way that Frank Lloyd Wright was very ahead of his time, was the way that he viewed the cutting up of space. And so I'll actually take this image that I have here. And
Are you gonna say like open areas, because we don't have that in the UK. Everything has to be tiny and confined and grey.
Yeah, yeah. I am going to talk about open areas. So if you look at this building, Frank Lloyd Wright's work was Victorian. He was a Victorian architect. But it was also, in some sense, it predated Victorian in that he used this natural stone, like an old cottage. But one way in which it was way ahead of its time was in the way that he looked at floor planning and space. And you can see that in this example here in the way that he locates his columns. So you have a column here and a column here. And the window stretches, continuous window. Obviously there's mullions, and that was a limitation of the technology at the time. But you have just this view that it wraps around even behind the column, and it goes around behind here. And he's figured out how to cantilever the structure out beyond the building so that he can thrust you out into the world, into the beautiful world of nature. In a European classical sense, especially if we're looking at that picture from earlier. Let's see. I have so many tabs, I'm losing it. But I think.
No,
I
but
think
we're getting
somewhere back
excited
here.
now. We're in the thick of it.
Yeah, we're really in the thick of it. So you look at how many tabs I'm making. When we were looking at the classical government building, I'm going to look up Federal Reserve. Federal Reserve building, I'll search.
Federal Reserve, when money comes to lose its value.
Yeah. So you look at a building. Yeah, let's look at this image. You look at a building like this one.
Oh, that's actually not
and
bad.
No, it has a rhythm to it, and the columns are everywhere. They're on the corners, and all of the windows have to peek out between them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that was kind of a traditional view of how things had to be done that Frank Lloyd Wright wanted to change, and Mies van der Rohe wanted to change. They both wanted to break open the space to the world around you. And that was one of the greatest things that minimalism achieved, especially if we look at that.
Can I add something for a second? It's actually funny because I'm conducting this this discussion from my conservatory, and it's a thing in the UK where if you want to like we didn't we didn't add it, but it's like if you don't like your garden that much and you want to like extend the space in the house, because a lot of houses has a very limited amount of space in them, and it's
Hmm.
funny because it's basically columns. It's like windows and columns. It's just glass and plastic for holding the thing, and it looks very much like the building you just showed in the countryside.
Oh, the Federal Reserve.
No, no,
Oh, the one in the countryside.
yes, because it's thin, like the the white bits between the windows isn't very big. The window is bigger, and then the white frames that hold the windows are relatively thin, and it does feel like you're
Hmm.
semi outside the building uh, as you're sitting
Hmm.
in the conservatory. So it's kind of like you are sitting outside, but you're comfortable inside because the weather isn't getting to you. It does actually feel quite calming sitting in the conservatory.
Yeah, we're using design to achieve the best of both worlds, right? Glass is an unbelievable material that we have access to. So much so that you can make entire buildings out of it. Apple has done that. Have you ever seen the Apple Glass Cube store?
Not
Um,
not in the U.S. No.
it's Apple is a company that's not afraid of using structural glass.
Oh wow, it's
They,
just a
they have
cube.
this. It's just glass, and the beams are made of glass, and the columns are made of glass,
Oh okay.
um, and the walls are made of glass. And this isn't my favorite building from it because to me this is too minimalist. Um, but I believe if I look up Apple Store in Bangkok, um,
Is that it? Is that actually the whole building? Like if you chuck a rock at it or
no, it's
something.
there's a stairway down. There's a
Okay.
stairway down that leads into the rest of it. So it's basically a foyer, but
Okay.
it's building. I like more when Apple does this sort of building. This
Okay.
is their Apple Store in Bangkok.
That does look a
Um,
little bit like a spaceship.
yeah, well, and it's Apple. They make tech products. This is like the one idea I want to convey is that architecture isn't about taking one type of building and copy and pasting it all over everywhere. It's about wanting to have good buildings for every individual context. And I think when you're a tech company like Apple and you've done so much to advance the way that that we design our technology and other companies like take off from them, and their whole brand is about this clean thing. Yes, your building should absolutely look like this. And once you do this, you're going to advance the technology in structural glass. This is like a 30-foot continuous piece of 1 inch thick glass um, that is the whole wall assembly. It's incredibly impressive from a structural design standpoint, and I love when brands push the engineering beyond what it was currently capable of doing. And Frank Lloyd Wright loved that too, and he recognized that Mies van der Rohe was doing it when when Miss when he made Crown Hall. This is a building I've been to personally that's in Illinois, and it's a studio for students. And what Mies van der Rohe was able to pull off here is instead of putting columns all throughout the floor plan of the building, he said, I don't want any columns. Instead, I'm going to hold the ceiling up from above. He did a suspended roof. It's something that's almost never done. But if you look at this building here, this here is a massive beam,
Mm.
and it bears on the columns here on either side of the building. There's one on the other side over here, I think. And it holds up the roof through its internal forces from having a great big beam that can't bend. And because he did that, he was able to open up the whole floor plan and put his walls wherever he wanted and have movable partitions that would change the way people could see the space. Which is a triumph when you're working with students who need to be constantly thinking about how they can change the world around them and need to have a lot of openness. You wouldn't want a building like this for um, let's say a parliament building or anything where you need to have conversations happening in separate individual offices.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but what minimalism was doing, especially in the way Mies van der Rohe was doing it, was pushing the technology forward, and it was opening up possibilities. And I think to kind of get back to your original question, that's the greatest merit of it.
Okay.
And then Yeah, and we talked about this Federal Reserve building a little bit. Let me find a bigger picture of it. This one's an Alamy stock photo, but you know what? I respect their right to put their brand all over it. Um, when you look at a building like this, you can see how there's an element on the one hand of the brutalism, in that there's these very harsh, solid forms that tower over you. But there's also an element of the cathedral where there's a rhythm and a pattern to it. Um, and this is a type of architecture that is trying to convey the glory of governance.
Yeah.
So you have the governance coming from the brutalist aspect, right? If it's just totalitarianism and force, that's when you have brutalism. And it doesn't matter that the building is ugly and that the concrete is harsh to the touch and it's staining with time because it has control over you regardless. That's the soul of brutalism. And then you have the soul of classicism, which is to create these forms that are so beautiful that they impress upon you that you're small and filthy and dirty and that your job unto them is reverence. And you take a building like this and you're kind of integrating the two together into a building that understands, on the one hand, that people desire beauty and balance, and on the other hand, that we're going to give the people force. And so that's where you get the glory of governance, I call it. And this is extremely popular with government buildings, especially ones that were made later on. I think earlier on, especially when Jefferson was in charge, he was more interested in, let's see, have you ever seen, I'm going to pull up Monticello. So Thomas Jefferson was one of the early influences on American architecture because he loved to travel to Europe, and he would bring things over from there. And this was Thomas Jefferson's Monticello. This was a building where he spent a lot of his time.
Mm.
And you can see there's not so much the aspect of dominance here. There's still an aspect of balance and pattern and unity to it, but less the dominance. That was something that came into American design later. Another example of that is if you look at most Capitol buildings. So I'll pull up the Wisconsin State Capitol because I think it's a pretty good one as far as Capitol design goes. I need a better picture than that. There. This is another building that's very much impressing upon you the glory of governance. It's not quite the glory of God. It's not on the level of the cathedral, and it's also not so harsh that it's just the hopelessness of governance. But they're trying to sell you on the idea. There's a beauty to it.
There's a cathedral-like element to it.
Yes. Yeah, and what the cathedrals were good at was, again, cathedrals at the time were pushing the technology forward. If you look at cathedrals, Gothic cathedrals, and Romanesque cathedrals, but a little bit less because Romanesque cathedrals are very, very chunky. And whereas Gothic cathedrals were trying to turn the stone almost into a liquid and cast open all of this potential. This is where if you build a Gothic cathedral so high enough, it wants to fall down. And so the engineers of the time had to come up with these. Sorry, I'm pulling images. In order to deal with the fact that this arch that they've created here over the nave of the building, in order to deal with the fact that it's got these long, slender columns on either side, it wants to bow out. And so they needed to supply extra forces because the building wanted to bow out this way. And so the engineers who were working on the building, who at the time, men of science were theists. They took the Aristotelian understanding to it. They said, well, Earth is so beautiful, it must have come from something. And that was their reasoning. And so they invented these men of reason invented the flying buttress that was going to cancel out the forces and allow them to build even higher. And that's what this is. This is a structural support. But even in building structural supports, there's a beauty to it, and they believe that it needed to be that way in order to celebrate the glory of God in a sense. And now that we have secularism in our society, we don't have to celebrate the glory of God because we can celebrate the glory of man. And so what we can do now is we can start to bring all of these details down to man's level and integrate them into his tactile environment rather than just building them way up high. But that's something architects haven't gotten very good at yet. Right now, architects are still figuring out minimalism, and they're still trying to figure out the structural language and the vernacular, what material to build with. Anytime we're building with stone today, we're building with veneer stone, whereas we used to build with monumental stone. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. But there was one building which I wanted to, on the topic of great engineers who worked on cathedrals. You can't talk about that without talking about the Sagrada Familia, which was Antoni Gaudi's masterwork, which was completed long after his demise. In fact, very recently, they finally completed this building, but it started construction in the 1800s. And this is a building where he was actually able to split the columns like trees at the very top. And he had a completely unique way of designing the structure of it because he invented a process of mirroring the structural loads. Typically, when you make a building, you set one block on top of another and you build the building up. And if it falls down, you did it wrong. Well, Antoni Gaudi discovered that he could model the process of carrying one load continuously to another in reverse. If he only hung strings from the ceiling, then he could apply weights to them that were equal in proportion to the weights of his building, and then look at how the strings naturally processed. And the way that they would hang would tell him where the columns needed to go in order to hold up that weight, because in the same way that something hangs, so it can stand.
Okay.
A string hangs straight down, a column stands straight up. So another example there of an amazing engineer, and I think I needed to show the exterior of a building because I only showed the interior of the Sagrada Familia. This is an example of an amazing feat of engineering, but also a very peculiar building as far as cathedrals go. This is like a future alien cathedral.
It does kind of seem like it's like a beehive or a wasp's nest or something.
Yes, Antoni Gaudi I think he used to call himself God's architect, or at least people called him that, because the guy was crazy. He would sleep on a cot and live completely monastically, and he would sleep on the build site, and he did nothing except work on this building for his entire lifetime until he died, like Noah working on Noah's Ark, and then they completed it long after he died. But even in his previous projects, there was this aspect of sinew to it. It looks like it's made of bone and tendon almost.
Mm.
And it's something that is a very strange crossing over of aesthetics into biology. Because you immediately compare the Sagrada Familia to a beehive. People who see this immediately compare usually these columns to bones. If you look at the front of his buildings, and there's like a muddiness to it almost, and like an undulation of it. It looks like seashells. So there you have a really interesting kind of value judgment being made. What does this say about the architect and his view of world? And what it says to me is that he wanted his designs not to harmonize with Frank Lloyd Wright, not to harmonize with nature like Frank Lloyd Wright's Usonian style, where Frank Lloyd Wright takes his canvas of architecture, and he says, I want to celebrate the world, but he still uses straight lines. He recognizes that his building is a building and nature is nature. He doesn't put a whole bunch of green colors on his carpet because green is the color of leaves, and I don't have leaves in here. Instead, he uses the red of red earth or the blue of the blue of perhaps like water, the sky reflecting. And he uses the tones of wood and the tones of sand. Antoni Gaudí has no such sensibility when it comes to color or when it comes to form. He does not see a dividing line between the things God makes or nature makes and the things that I make. So to him, he was trying to unify the two, and I think it was a very interesting experiment. But I don't find this sort of thing beautiful in the way that I find a Frank Lloyd Wright building to it,
Mm-hmm.
because it has the reverence is applied in a different way, and it's kind of in the uncanny valley. It's like close to something that looks like natural, but it's also very, very gross and strange and weird.
Um, would you like to transition from this to your Minecraft server?
Um, I think I'm gonna end on the Minecraft server. What I'm gonna do now, because I've talked through a lot of my statements about value judgment, is I want to pull up um, the treat that I made for today.
Okay,
I
let's have a treat.
which is yes, which is my architectural alignment chart. Are you familiar with alignment charts?
Don't think I am now.
Okay, so it's um, it's an idea that came from the people who do Dungeons and Dragons, and they wanted a broad form way of describing
Oh,
different
like
character archetypes.
like lawful neutral, lawful
Exactly.
good, lawful bad.
These are these are the alignments, and these refer to a person's character when they play D&D.
Okay.
So I'm the first person who has created an architectural, an objective architectural alignment chart.
Internet first,
And
right
that's what
here, folks.
yeah, and I have it right here.
Okay.
And so here's an example for us that we get to discuss now, of everything from the lawful good to the chaotic evil, of how buildings express themselves and what their value assessments say. And we can start. A fun fact about this: if you rotate this image 180 degrees, it becomes a political compass. We have the authoritarian right here. We have the authoritarian left. We have the the
Okay.
freedom and expression, and then on the left we have weird nature stuff. Um,
Oh wow, that's it. That's
but
really interesting, actually, if you think about it.
yeah, so if we go through this building, I want to talk about what I'm saying with this, um, which is so along. I've kind of gone through a lot of these buildings as we've talked, but I haven't talked about the one on the left. That's the Chicago Theater, and it's a building. I'll pull up a bigger picture of it, although no picture is going to do it justice. Um, but the Chicago Theater is also a stand-in in this chart. It's a stand-in for a lot of really beautiful classical ornate architecture. Um, Again, we're going to accept the fact that it's a stock photo. But look at all of what's going on in this building. It's just as extreme in all the stuff that's going on as Gaudí's work. But instead of having the sinewyiness to it, it has to it a natural rhythm, and it has a celebration of nature. Over here it has
Like the golden
the
ratio there?
flowered forms. Yeah, there's all sorts of reverence to proportion that you wouldn't get out of a more nihilistic style. So this is intensely value driven, and it's also intensely ornate, and with all of these tiny little references to tradition built into it. You make a building like this, and you have the existence of laurels as a design motif is something that goes all the way back to ancient Greeks. So a building like this, it has a classicalness to it, which in the context of our alignment chart is what I'm calling lawful, because it's kind of the existing status of the land, the existing rules. And then there's something that's really great about it, the way that they're expressing themselves in a way that's internally consistent and consistent with man's nature and consistent with the building's function. You go to this building, this one in particular is a theater. What better place for the building that's around you to be an experience and to tell a story to you? You wouldn't want a building like this to be minimalist. the theater is all about drama. A minimalist story is like the guy walks onto stage and he goes to work and then he goes home. Um, so it's not of any value to you to strip the detail out of a place like this. A
Okay.
place like this, it's a moment of grandeur and you're celebrating it. And so that's my lawful good. And then you talk about something that's neutral good. And maybe you don't care so much about tradition. Maybe you don't care about like elevating all these own forms. Maybe you just want to do something that's completely new unto itself and that has it has all of its reverence out of the time and place that you are. And that's where you get a building like the Marin County Civic Center that's for me in the neutral good category, and it's where I put all of the Usonian architecture that we looked at. These buildings that have a I want to find a new example of the Usonian style on my screen here. Yeah, this one's good. Um, all these ones that aren't classical in their approach to art, but neither are they modernist, and neither are they naturalist. They're romanticizing something about a human experience. It's the red of the sunset. It's the sand of the beach. This is a celebration of where you are and how you experience the world, and that goes in and that's contextual depending on where you are. And then as we go into the chaotic example, this is where on the chaotic realm, the chaotic represents postmodernism. So in a sense, we have on our chart here, we have classical or traditionalist, we have enlightenment, and then we have postmodern. And when you get into postmodern, now your job is really to wage war on the forms that we've shown before and to completely reinvent not only the aesthetic motifs but the fundamentals of them. And so a building like the Sagrada Familia is doing that in a really creative way. And then as we go down the chart, we have buildings that are more neutral aesthetically. These buildings are, rather than coming up with extraordinary, necessarily design aesthetic motifs, like on the personal level of interacting with the building. You look at the Sydney Opera House, and it's first of all a very benevolent view of chaotic neutral, because there are buildings I could have put in the chaotic neutral section that are much uglier than this. But I chose this as an example because when you look at this building, it's very clean. You don't go up to it and find the ornateness that you find with a lot of the buildings that I put up in the good category that are really expressing themselves and having a fractal level of detail. But you also have something where they're completely changing the game as far as the form. No other building is shaped like this, right? This is considered to be one of the best examples of early postmodernism.
Okay.
And the shape of the building, he was actually mirroring ships in a harbor. So it's like sails on a building. And so again, you have that aspect from what Antoni Gaudi was doing, where instead of the architecture kind of being its own thing next to the thing, postmodernism has this tendency to try and make the building become the thing, and to try and make it into something that it's not. But in a building like this, again, I think a theater is a great place, or an opera house in this case, is a great place to have some real fun with it and make a building that's an experience to go to. So that's to me that made it a great example of something that's chaotic neutral. And then of course we have true neutral. This was one of the first images I put on the slide, because what could be more neutral than Mies van der Rohe's triumph of I suppose minimalism that he achieved here in the city where it belonged. This building isn't like the other ones where it's building in the aesthetic motifs of anything in particular. It's stripped away all the aesthetic motifs. It's neutral now, and it's focused on standing up straight. And then on the aspects of classical form versus modern Enlightenment form, and versus postmodern form. This building isn't paying any reverence to the classics, and it's not doing anything goofy with the future. It's what makes sense in the now. That's the true neutral. So it's Enlightenment principles applied to common sense aesthetics. And then as we go down further here, we have the evil buildings. And what does evil mean in this sense? Well, in the same way that these buildings up here are celebrating life in one way or another, whether it's wacky or traditional or born of the earth that it's on. All of these buildings celebrate all of the detail and everything there is to see and perceive in life. And all of these buildings they're more neutral with regards to that. They want the clean lines down in the neutral section. And as we get down here we find an aggression against detail. So these buildings take respectively the classical, I suppose I was using Enlightenment for the central column, but in here we'll still call it neutral. The classical, neutral, and completely postmodern approaches to how to convey the feeling of dominance. This is a building that instead of celebrating your achievements as a being, celebrating your experience on Earth, they demean it. They make you feel small. And I'll talk through what all of these examples are, because they're the middle one. Actually, I don't know what that building is, and it doesn't really serve much. It doesn't really need. It's not of much importance. It's an office building. The entire point of the neutral evil category is it's completely monotonous. It's neither chaotic nor is it classical. But this one I'll start on the one on the left, and you might even recognize this building. A lot of people who are into politics recognize this building as Hitler's capital of what was going to be his new state. Hitler worked with an architect named Albert Speer, and their architecture was to be uniquely fascist.
I was kind of actually thinking that it's a sort of prison to begin with. Like you're supposed to house criminals there and don't try to escape. In a
Well,
sense.
this is a government building, believe it or not. The vision for this building, because this building was never built. Indeed, it's a model. The vision for this building was that inside.
I meant on the right.
Oh, on the right, yeah, they get more prisony on the right, and on the left they look more like a Capitol building or like a government building.
Okay.
I'm starting on the left. The vision for this building was that people would go inside and you would have this great chanting mob of I forget what they call them, the Volk. They would all gather in the space down below and they would sing their praises unto the Fuhrer, right? And the entire purpose of the building is to dominate power over these tiny, puny humans, and to impress upon them the glory of the Reich. You can't make a building like this and have it be completely hideous, but neither can you make a building like this entertain the common man. It needs to impress upon him his duty. And so that's the same as we were talking about with the Federal Reserve. And with a lot of Capitol buildings, this is a building that wants to get the glory of governance onto you. But I'm not going to say that every Capitol building is evil, because they do it in a better way. This building specifically, though, is evil. This building is doing it in a way that's so domineering that you're to be a speck at the foot of this massive, at the foot of the power of the Fuhrer and the Reich. That was the idea with this building. And then as we go towards the office block here in the middle, this is sort of almost like Le Corbusier, his vision of a brutalist building. It's there's not much to say about it because it's meant to be monotonous. It's meant to be boring and, like you said, like a prison. A building like this, what values does this convey about the person, especially if you like this? There are people who like this. Some people like something that's really awful and it says something about them. Not necessarily that they're awful, but that there's something wrong inside. There's something wrong inside the person who made this building.
Maybe it's I like my privacy.
Maybe.
No, sorry, I meant
if it was a house.
again. I meant on the right because it's on a lake.
Ah, yes, we're
and you
gonna
can
get to
then,
this one.
yeah.
This one's a real piece of work. This to me is one of the ugliest buildings ever made. But I'm just working my way from left to right here.
This
Um,
I want to save money and put as many people as I can inside.
yeah, there's a nihilism to it.
Mm.
There's definitely a materialism to it, and this is the type of architecture that you're going to see in communist states.
Mm.
Because if you think about Marx was a materialist, right? Um, he wanted the proletarians he wanted everyone's basic needs to be met, and that until we have everyone's basic need, and I'm not an expert on Marx, so I probably shouldn't walk into hot
No,
water
it's
here,
fine.
but um,
Just throw assumptions out. It's okay.
if you are a person who wants everyone's base physical material needs to be met with no reverence at all for nourishment unto the spirit,
Hmm.
you think of that as a nonsense, as a spook. Why would I need to? Why would people need art? All you need is the roof. Then this is the building for you. This is nihilism and monotony. It's pure pragmatism of the moment, but with not even the aesthetic sensibility of something like this building. And then as we go on to the right, we progress from the neutral over to the postmodern. And this is the Bangladesh Parliament building.
Oh wow.
This is and believe it or not, this building was constructed entirely by hand. Um, Literally by like third world people carrying little buckets of concrete and pouring it into the forms. Um, it's And there's an unbelievable quote from Louis Kahn, if you that describes how he was building this building. Um, in fact, I think I can pull it up here. Open link. Open image in new tab. Open original. There we go. Got it. This is Louis Kahn describing this building. Architect Louis Kahn himself had earlier quoted on his design. In the assembly, I have introduced a light-giving element to the interior of the plan. If you see a series of columns, you can say that the choice of columns is a choice of light. The columns as solids frame the spaces of light. Now, think of it just in reverse, and think that the columns are hollow and much bigger, and that their walls can themselves give light. Then the voids are rooms, and the column is the maker of light, and can take on complex shapes, and be the supporter of spaces, and give light to spaces. I am working to develop the element to such an extent that it becomes a poetic entity that has its beauty outside of its place in the composition. In this way, it becomes analogous to the solid column I mentioned above as a giver of light. So,
I didn't get
so
that.
that's the
I
spiel.
didn't get that impression at all. I don't know what he's talking about.
Um, and what he's saying is he's saying don't look at the finishes because it's all about the light and the space. And I'm telling you the light and the space are good. And if you're questioning me, then that's because you don't understand.
Okay.
Um, I'm gonna pull up a little bit more of what he was talking about on the interior of this building,
Oh,
which is
okay, but could we just
mm, what are you saying?
sorry, I was just we're coming into like an hour and 20. If we could just see quickly what's inside.
Oh, gotcha. Um, yeah, and well, we're right at the end of our architectural alignment chart, so we'll touch on the Minecraft server very briefly, and then we'll be done. Um, he was talking when he said that certainly about the interior of the building, which is all of this morass of stairwells
Oh,
and of it's actually the same on the inside as it is on the outside. Um, and so to him, this is what it means to be playing with light. But it's still a building that look at the chair sitting up against the wall. There's like a poetic cruelty to that
is it
environment.
is it a bit like something from the original Matrix movie, like where
Yeah, it
Neo
could
would
be.
come in and shoot people inside a building like this or something?
Yeah. And then you look at a space like this, and you can see in some sense a parallel to the Reich building we were looking before, where you have all of these small people down below the mighty form. But instead of the mighty form having this glory to it, now it has a confusion to it. And so this is an even more a deeper expression of evil because it works confusion into the design intentionally.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Um, like every dictator wants you to be confused by the world so that you're more reliant on his word on what is law.
Oh, fair enough.
So that completes my description of the architectural alignment, and then I do have some pictures to show just since I I'm a freak, so I get done with my work doing architecture and my free time reading about architecture, and then I play a video game where I get to make architecture in the video game, um, and that's how I live. So I have just a few shots. Unfortunately, the Minecraft server where I did most of my work, the map changed, and so I don't have access to a lot of the old builds. But there were a few that I worked on there for a long time that I was quite proud of. Um, this one was a lighthouse, and I'm I need to get it more central in the picture. I'll do it this way. Um, this one, if I go over here, here, I'll do this. This one was a lighthouse that I made. I wanted to cut across the water, and as you walk across this area here, I wanted you to get the feel of being on the edge of the ocean. And I built this lighthouse in a component as a reason for the building to be there, as a central purpose to it. And it casts light out on it. And I even figured out in Minecraft how to make the light blink on top, so you could see it out from the water. And this was me in a boat looking out on it, on the building that I made.
Okay.
So that was a very clean building. I'm choosing a white because it goes with the white sands on the edge of an ocean, for example. In this case, I wanted the monochrome because with a lighthouse, you want it to be black and white so it's visible, stands out like impact text on an old meme. And then I also had the building that I was working on for myself was this loop-shaped one, and I have another picture here that's from like down on the level of it, where I would stand and look out on the harbor that I built it in. I built this great big circle that went all around the whole thing, and I had my crafting stations off to the side. But it was all about enjoying the place that I was in the game, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I built this little banner, and I would put that around the building as a design motif, and I tried to work in the colors of what it meant to be in that space. And the whole reason for making a loop at the end was so that I could put ice on the top. I don't know if you played Minecraft, but in that game, if you set a boat down on ice, it slides like an ice skater.
Okay.
And so it's basically a racetrack where I could race with people around the top of my building. I just getting an element of fun into the building and really celebrating what it's like to be in that place.
What happens when you skate off the top and fall off the ring?
Then you fall into the water and it's
Oh,
fun.
it's
It's
fun.
a harbor
Okay.
down below.
No problems.
Yeah, you land in the water, so you're all good. And then finally, there was another building I made, and this isn't the best view of it. I have a much better view of it that I'll pull up here. But this is it overlooking the marketplace. I made a house for the guy who actually ran the server. His name Daniel Sagner. He took it upon himself to set up the railroad in the server, so he was a railroad tycoon. And I built the mansion of a railroad tycoon here. I built it over the railroad. You can see the green coming in, and the railroad came through the basement space. I built like a huge underground workshop space that the railroad would drive through, with these little peaks into the inner sanctum. And then the house itself was stretched out across the land and out over it with all of these little views and balconies. And the thing about designing in a game like this is you don't have to worry about the roof leaking, and you don't have to worry about something falling down if there's not structural support on it. So you take it upon yourself in whatever space you're working on to get the absolute most that you can out of it. And in this case, I just wanted a place that was fun to frolic around, and in every space give you tons of stimulation and spiritual nourishment and stuff to do. Little garden patches and little places to store things, and secret hidden doors are all throughout this building, but I won't tell anyone where they are because that's for the owner to know. So this was another project that it took me a long time to actually design how I was going to do it.
It does look like it would take a long time, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's people who they use programs and they use World Edit to make massive things in Minecraft, and maybe at some point I'll get on that level. But for now, I just play Minecraft. Um, I go into Minecraft as a professional architect and a casual gamer, not a professional gamer and a casual architect. So, um,
One
a house like this is like a medium size,
one block at a time.
one block at a time, baby. Um, so I know we're running into our reasonable time limit. So maybe I can return. Yeah, I'll sit on the alignment chart here. Um, is there anything else that you wanted to talk about to sort of like
Uh,
um,
no, it was like
put that?
quite a journey. I feel like I've been through a journey, through new things, and you as the guide on this journey. And I feel like I've
Yeah,
learned
I
en
have.
entirely different things than I did before coming in.
Yeah, what the things I want to impress upon people is, first of all, there's so much good architecture and so many different types of good architecture. You don't want to be the guy who's like all classical architecture is bad or all modern architecture is bad. It's the same as being a person who swears off country music or swears off rap music. It says all that is bad. Well, you can have problems with the genre, but you have to recognize when someone does it well, and that's true of so many buildings here. Is that there's ways to do things well, and the things that you're doing says something about you. And sometimes it says something really bad, and sometimes it says something that is strange in one context but makes sense in another. And so it has its own place. It's not something you want to see everywhere, but it has its place. Many buildings are like that. Um, and I suppose a final note that I want to leave with everyone, that every architect should always try to impress, is that you should value aggressively the spaces that you're in. You want them to be interesting. You want them to be tactile. You want them to be um, beautiful above all, because that's going to nourish your soul, and that's a major component of a building's function that the materialists take completely for granted, and the classicists often misunderstand, and the minimalists often forget. But people who do architecture well understand that a building needs to be beautiful because it's nourishing your soul, and you want to enjoy the space. And there's so many ways to do that well. It's a challenge that I'm going to spend the rest of my life figuring out what a good building is and how to do it really well. Um, so I appreciate you giving me. This is the first time someone's given me a platform to talk about it, as an expert in that way.
No,
But it's certainly something I intend to do more of.
I'm really pleased that you came on. It's the whole thing has been extremely impressive and enlightening, and something for me to think about. And I really hope that people watching this video, or I'm quite certain that people who do watch this video will get that same impression. So again, thank you so much, Amos. Um,
Yeah, I'll shout myself out. If you want to reach out to me, I do give, at my own convenience, opinions on buildings. If you see a funky looking building, it's something my friends do. They send me a building and they say, "What do you think about this one?" And I don't always have time to provide a long answer, but I love. Sometimes I do, and I love doing it. So if you want to reach out to me for expertise on architecture of any kind, you can find me on Twitter at Seamus Riley. That's at SaeMusRiley.
yeah, I'll include that also in the description of the video. So again, thank you very much,
Perfect.
and I'll let you go, and yeah, I hope people really enjoy this video.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Zombie Hunter, for the platform. Later.
No problem. Thank you.